Hello and welcome. I'm Dave. Today we're going to add CORS, rate limiting, and more to our Nest.js REST API. And I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. I'll also provide a link for you to join my Discord server where you can discuss web development with other students, and you can ask questions that I can answer and receive help from other viewers too. I look forward to seeing you there. This tutorial is lesson 6 of a Nest.js series, and today's starting code is the completed source code from lesson 5. If you haven't watched the previous lesson, there's a link to the playlist for this series in the video description, and I recommend you start at the beginning as each lesson will build on the ones before it. Today we will add CORS, rate limiting, server logs, and an exception filter for improved error reporting, especially with Prisma that we introduced in the last lesson. Now, I've had requests to add microservices and authentication to this series, but I think those topics both deserve their own mini-series of videos. So today will be the last video lesson of this Nest.js for Beginners series, and we will have completed creating a REST API that you can deploy as you would any Node.js application. We're starting in the docs today, and we're looking at the Global Prefix. And as you see, they attach it directly to the app that is set in the main.ts file that we have, and it adds a global prefix. Now, we were previously requesting things at the employees endpoint, but now we really want to attach API because most APIs use that, and that of course says where our API is. So we want to go /API/employees or to whatever other resources we would create. And we can attach API to all of those resources if we put a global prefix. So let's go back to VS Code and add that first. We're back in VS Code. I have the source directory open here in the file tree. I'm going to go to the main.ts file. You can see we have our app right here, and then we await and have app.listen on port 3000. But in between those, we can actually attach our set global prefix. Let's say app.set global prefix. Now inside of here, all we need to do is put API. It will handle the slashes in between each level for us. And now we're back in the docs and we're looking at CORS. CORS stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. It's very important when you're setting up a REST API. And if you've worked on the front end at all, you may have received a response from a request that said the CORS header did not exist. So you know it's probably important that we configure CORS so people that are not on our domain at another origin, so cross-origin, can actually request some data from our API. Now we can keep a list of allowed origins and only let those domains access what we have at our domain. But if you just set it up like this, where they show enable CORS, essentially you're opening it up for everyone. So if we wanted to have a public REST API, we could just say app.enable CORS, and that would open it up for everyone. However, CORS does take an optional configuration object argument, and it's no different than the typical package we would use if we created a REST API with just Node.js and Express. And in fact, we used that exact configuration in my Node.js for Beginners course, and there's a link to that in the GitHub repo for this series because it was a recommended prerequisite. Now let's go ahead and quickly look at that configuration. I'm not going to use it today, but I'm in my GitHub repo for that Node.js course, and we can see this configuration right here. It defines origin inside of an object, and it has a function in here. And that's all explained in that other video. I'm not going to go back through it, but notice it's using allowed origins that are imported, and you can see in the allowed origins file that I just put in, say, yoursite.com, whatever your domain would be, and then typically what we would have, at least what we had at the time when we were running anything on our local host in dev mode. So there were those options as well. But anyway, you can get all of this in my Node.js course, and that is linked in the README for this Nest.js series as a prerequisite. So now let's go back to VS Code and enable CORS so we can at least have a public API and everyone can request our resources. Okay, we're back in VS Code right where we had the set global prefix. Let's go ahead and add another line right before that, and let's say app.enable CORS, and of course we need the parentheses to call that into action. And there we have now configured CORS, very easy in Nest.js. But again, I emphasize this is opening it up to everyone, so cross-origin requests are allowed. You would need to add that configuration object if you wanted to limit who could access the resources through CORS. And speaking of limiting, we are now discussing rate limiting. Here in the docs, you can see we need to add another dependency as we add rate limiting. It says npm I. We don't need the -- save. That happens automatically anymore. But then at nestjs/throttler. So let's go back to VS Code. We'll add this in and I'll show you how to implement it. Back in VS Code, let's open up a terminal window. I'm going to paste in what we talked about, npm I at nestjs/throttler. Let's go ahead and add this as a dependency to our REST API project here in Nest.js. It shouldn't take too long. And then we'll go ahead and apply it to the project. And we're not going to do that in the main TS. We're actually going to do that here in the app.module.ts file. So let's start with the imports we need at the top. So we're going to import throttler and then module. And then we also need throttler. I spell that right. A strange word, actually. Throttler guard. There we go. From Nest.js throttler. We need one more import. So we're also going to import. Now this is all caps. So app_guard. And that is going to come from at nestjs/core. There we go. Let's go ahead and save those changes. Now we need to apply that to our module underneath. The imports are getting a little long. I'll scroll up here and let's put each one of these on a different line. So we had started out with a users module example in the earlier lessons. Then we added the database module and the employees module. That's all good. Now we need to add the throttler module here. So I'll put one more comma after that and on a new line. Let's have a line in between. There we go. Throttler module. I seem to have a hard time typing that one. For root. Now inside of the parentheses, we need to start an array and then an object. Now there's two values here, TTL, so time to live. I'm going to set that at 60,000. These are milliseconds again. And then I'm going to set this really low so you can see what happens when we exceed the limit. So I'm going to set this limit to 3. And if there's any confusion here, 60,000 would be 1 minute. So only 3 requests in 1 minute. That's super low. I can easily exceed that. 1,000 milliseconds would be 1 second. But we're not quite finished because we also need to do something here with the provider. So after the app service, let's put a comma, and now let's start an object. And now inside of this object, we're going to say, I need lowercase, provide, and this is where we'll use the app guard that we imported. After that, we'll say use class, and this is where we'll put the throttler guard that we imported. And now that should apply the throttler module, essentially rate limiting our entire application. Now we will look at how to override this on a pre-module basis, or actually also a pre-route basis. So you can drill down to each thing and override the default that you have set, or defaults as we'll soon see. But let's go ahead and look at what error this gives. And to do that, we need to go ahead and start up npm run start:dev, and we'll get our REST API going, and then we need to make a request to our now /API/employees endpoint. I'm going to use my built-in Thunder Client extension as I have in this series. You could use whatever you want to, whether it's Postman or some other piece of software that you use to send requests. And now you can see here, let's see, I've got a fake role here of pasta. Let's remove that. And now we've got /API/employees. Also, since we're in a dev environment, make sure it's just HTTP and not HTTPS. I'm going to send a request. It's good. That's fine. We got all the employees. Let me send it again. And again, we've hit our limit of 3. I send number 4. We get a status code 429, throttler exception, too many requests. That's exactly what we wanted. We have limited the amount of requests any one client could make from our API. Again, I set that way low. Let's go back and look at some other settings that we can put in. Back to the app.module.ts file, we'll look at the file tree over here again. Now, instead of just this one setting, we can actually put in some named settings. So let's do that. We start with this object here. Let's go ahead and give it a name, and let's call this one short. Now, for our time to live, let's make this 1 second. And let's say we want no more than 3 requests in any 1 second. That's a little bit more realistic from the same client, again, not in total from everyone. Now, besides that, we can add another object here with another name. So I could just copy this object again, and then we could change some values. So I'll paste that in here. Let's call this one long. You could have more than 2 if you wanted. Now for long, I'll put this back to 1 minute, and let's say we want no more than 100 requests in 1 minute. So 2 different values. Now they both apply also. So no more than 3 requests in 1 second, and no more than 100 requests in any 1 minute duration. Now, I'm not sure I could click fast enough to show this example, but I'll leave this in the code just so you have it here. Now let's look at how we can override this inside of our employees resource. Let's open up the employees directory and go to the employees controller. Here we need to import skip throttle if we're going to use it, and throttle if we're going to use it. So I'll import both throttle and skip throttle. And those are going to come from at nestjs/throttler. There we go. Now that we have both, if we wanted to skip the throttler, essentially the rate limiting, for this entire resource, this entire controller, we could just say at skip throttle and call it right here at the top above the controller. And that would skip it for everything inside this controller. So that's one possibility. Another is, let's say we wanted to skip it for most everything, but we wanted to apply it to our get all, where we get all the employees here, or find all method under our get route. And here we would put another skip throttle, but now inside we pass an object, and we would have default, and here we would say false. It accepts a Boolean value. So the default is actually usually true. So when you just say skip throttle and call it, it's going to skip everything after it. But now if we put this decorator for skip throttle just above this get request to find all the employees, then it's going to go ahead and rate limit this particular get request. So that's a nice addition besides the control we have at essentially the global level for our application. But now let's say we wanted to override the defaults for a different route. Of course, you could do this for the entire class as well here at the top of the controller. But let's just do it here for our find one route that's also a get request. So above this, I'm going to put throttler. Now inside of here, we pass an object as well. Now previously, we had some other names already. We had short and we had long instead of just default. So we could override that and we could say short. Here we could have an object. You have to have the same values. So time to live, let's say in, what was that? That was like, I think it was in 1 second. We said no more than 3 requests. Let me quickly look at that object once again. So yeah, limit is the next one. So here we have the name, but it's different. We don't have name short. We just have short here with an object. So now we say limit, and let's say we're going to limit this to 1 request because I might be able to actually exceed that. And I seem to have a TypeScript issue here. I don't think I did this right. Throttler doesn't seem right. Yes, I imported throttle, not throttler. So I need to remove the R there. And now we should be okay. So, oh, we need the decorator in front of it as well. So I totally messed that up. I added an extra character here and I left the decorator off the back. So here we have at throttle. It is a decorator. Now we have our named rate limiting that we previously defined in app module of short. And we're overriding that. We're still saying 1 second, but now we're saying a limit of 3. You can do that. If you don't have any named, if you set it up like I did in the very beginning, before we had any of these named settings, you can use default here and you can override your default as well. So either one works. We'll call this short Let's go ahead and save this change. Now I want to make a request again to API/employees and then put an ID after it. And I want to try to make more than one request in 1 second. Let me see if I can do that. So back here in Thunder Client, we had too many requests before, but now we should be okay for the first one. I'm going to request employee with an ID of 1. And let's make sure we can get that data. Yep, that's me there. So, okay, now I'm going to request it twice in 1 second if I can. Yep, we've got a 429 because we were able to override that short setting on that one specific route in the controller by passing the @throttle decorator, once again, after I corrected myself, overriding that short value that we set in the module here with the name of short. Now you don't have to do that, but it's nice to have that option. And now you know how to add rate limiting at the full global app level, as well as to any controller and also to any given route. Override any of those you want to, or skip any of the rate limiting you want to anywhere you want to. We're back in the docs and looking at Logger under techniques for logging in the Nest.js docs. Now I want to say right up front that many deployed applications make use of other logging packages like Winston, but we're going to quickly look at what is built into Nest.js, and we're going to use it today as we create an error exception handler that grabs all of the errors, including those that we might get as validation errors from Prisma. And so we'll throw that together fairly quickly, and it just gives you another option in your skills. So let's start by looking at the basic customization. And you can see we're going to bring in Logger here, and we could just set it to false so we're actually not logging anything. And as you might guess, you could also log everything. So after that, we want to look at what else we could set Logger to if it's not false. And here we can give it an array, and we can choose several things: log, fatal, error, warn, debug, and verbose. We can choose any of those we want. And of course, every time we make a save and make changes in our dev mode, we're going to see the Nest.js server reboot with those changes. You'll see a lot of log messages as everything starts up. We're going to move right on to a custom implementation. Now, what you can do with the custom implementation is essentially override the common Logger service that is built into Nest.js. So you can see the class here, and it shows you the methods in the class. You've got log, fatal, error, warn, and so on. You could overwrite all of these. We're not going to do that. Most of these are fine just the way they are, and we might not want all of those, but of course you could, and the code is right here in the docs to grab the skeleton of this class and put your logic in here. You might even be writing to a text file when you log these errors, as well as sending them to the console in the server. So now, after we scroll down here, it's going to talk just a little bit more about what we can do, and one of those things is to extend the built-in logger. That's something I'm more interested in doing. So now we could import console logger, and then we could create a class called myLogger that extends console logger, and then we could put in any method that we want to kind of piggyback on here. So just like the error handler, and then we call super.error, so it goes ahead and does what it normally would have done with console logger back in the built-in logger configuration up here in the logger service. So if we implement this, we might have something we want to use. Let's go ahead and do that in VS Code. We're back in VS Code. I'm going to press Control-C here in the terminal to stop our server. Also go to the file tree over here so we can see what's going on. We've got our employees. Here is the app module. And now in the terminal, I'm going to type nest g module my-logger, and we're going to create a new module, and we should see a new folder over here named myLogger that has that module in it. It doesn't have everything we need by any means, but it's a good start. We're also going to need to create a provider, so a service, nest g service my-logger. And now it should create the extra files we expect with the service, and there they are. And not much in here yet either. So let's create the service first, and then we'll bring it back into the module. Now this is going to be as custom as you want it to be, so you don't necessarily have to copy mine. You'll have mine finished in the completed source code for this lesson. But the main thing is to get the concept of how you put this together. So after we export the class, we want to say extends console logger, which we haven't imported yet. I was hoping it would just automatically at the top, but it's not going to happen. So I'll say import console. Oh, we already have injectable up there at the top. So let's just go ahead and add console logger right here in this line. Console logger. So it comes from the same Nest.js common. So we've extended console logger. Now inside of this class, we can go ahead and add whatever method that we want to kind of piggyback on. So it's one that already exists in console logger, but we want to add a little bit more to it. In this case, I'll work with the most common ones, just log and error. So we'll start with log. Now, if we mouse over, let's see if TypeScript helps us at all. It says it implicitly has any here. So it's not helping us a whole lot, but I do know what what log takes in. It's going to have a message, and it's typically defined as any here, and then context. And let's say this is optional and it's a string. Now you could look back in that logger service to see what these actually are, because you want to match these up. So now I'm going to combine both of these, and we'll say const entry, because this is going to be a log entry into a text file log that I keep. So we would have a template literal here, and I'm going to start with the context. I'm going to separate them with a tab, which is a backslash with a lowercase t, and then I'm going to put the message. So I want a tab delimited log text file that could be imported into an Excel spreadsheet if that's what I wanted to do. So after that, here I'm going to call a method that's actually going to record that entry into that text file, but we haven't written that method yet. So here we want super.log, and let's look at what log wants here. And this is possibly what we need to see. No, this is not where I saw it. Oh, yes, it is. There we go. Console logger.log, message, any, context is optional, and it's a string. So you want to match that when you are taking in here with log. That's essentially what you want. So now that we have that, we just pass in the message and the context here to the super.log. Now, of course, we're not using entry yet, but we will as we write to a text file. Let's do one more of these. Let's start with error. And now we don't know what error takes in yet either. So let's do this the way that would make sense. And that was if you were to call super and now also have error here. And then let's look at what error wants here. And we see it up above, message any stack or context string. And I think you could just copy it right out of here. You sure can with Control C. We can put that in there. That's what should be called with the error. And I totally wasn't thinking because I put it in the wrong spot. It shouldn't go in there. Even though we read it from there, it should go in up here, and that's why it should match. Here's where you're actually calling it. So it wants the message, and it also wants the stack or context. And now it's going to be happy as well. Anything else you want to do can come before that. Once again, I just wanted to find that same entry with the context and the message. And we would eventually write to an error log here if we wanted to as well. Actually, it's not context, it's stack or context that we would have right there. So just a little different that you have to customize. And now whatever would normally happen inside of the error could be here. And I don't really think we need to have those curly braces because I didn't with log either. We just call it with super.error. And that should be good. So if we wanted to write to our text file, it would be in between both of these. And now I'm going to add some Node.js code that was very similar to what I had in my Node.js for Beginners series. So I'm not going to go over every little bit of it with you, but it's just about creating a log file directory and writing or appending to that log file if it exists, and if not, creating it. So we've got a few imports up here with the file system, promises from the file system, promises, and path. After that, I'm just going to paste in my function that is called log to file here. It'll actually be a method inside of my logger service is what this is called, and we could shorten that to my logger, but my logger service is just fine. And I put that in so I can wrap that down with Alt-Z, quickly show you what I'm doing. It's an async method that accepts that entry that we are creating. I'm adding to that here with a formatted entry that also brings in the current date, and then it ends it with a new line character, so each entry is on a new line. What happens is it checks to see if that directory logs exists. If it does exist, then or if it doesn't exist, actually it goes ahead and makes the directory. If it does exist, it just appends to the file, and the file is going to be called my log file. And of course, you could actually add another param here to this, and you could write to different files if you wanted to pass in the file name all the time. And this is in a try catch block as well. So that's what we're doing. Now let's go ahead and call that inside of the methods here, because this is the whole reason we added this. We extended the console logger so we could add a little functionality. Well, our added functionality is to write to these files. So inside of our log here, we want to say this dot log to file, which is our method, and then we want to pass in the entry we defined. And I'm going to do the same thing. Copy that without making a mistake, and do the same thing here inside of our error method as well. And again, if I went too fast on this function, first of all, I'm going to recommend my Node.js course, because if you're learning Nest.js, you need to already know how to do some of the basic things with files in Node.js, because that's lying underneath Nest.js. So you should go back and, of course, look at my Node.js for Beginners course. And if not, this is going to be in the finished source code for this video. And now we have just a little bit to do inside of our my-logger.module file. So here we have my-logger service imported already. That's good. Providers, my-logger service. Now we also need an exports here. So let's say exports, and inside of this would be my-logger service as well. And now at the bottom, we have my-logger module. And really, that is all that's needed for this file. So now if you wanted to use this globally, it's not too hard to do. I'm not going to end up doing that today, but I'll quickly show you how to do it. After we created our module, it was automatically already imported into the app.module.ts, and we see that was created for us here. It brought it in at the top as well, so we should see that import, and you should see it in the app module. That's fine, but that's not the only thing we need. We need to go to the main.ts file. So if we're going to use this, we've got the app module here inside of the nestfactory.create method. Then we want to put in a comma and have an object. And this is where we would set those other settings that we briefly looked at, like logger false, or we would pass in an array and say the different types of logging we wanted, like verbose. But here, instead of any of those, we would go ahead and put buffer logs. And now here would say true. Now this is because this is outside of any module, and you've got to give just a little buffer to make sure that that service has been instantiated. So that's what buffer logs is all about. Now there's one more thing you have to do after that, and that would be to say app.useLogger. Now we pass in app.get, and here we would say my logger service, and let's see, yes, it imported that automatically at the top for it. Now that is all you need to use that logger service globally. So now it would be active everywhere, and that's fine. It could get full of a lot of those startup logs as we would restart. Of course, you wouldn't normally restart your server nearly as much as you do in dev mode, but there it is all applied globally. However, I don't want to use that today, so I'm going to remove it. You just want to remember how to do it here. So I'm going to go ahead and take it out of here, and I don't want it with the app module up here either. So I'll go ahead, get rid of that configuration and remove the import as well. We're going to use it individually on a class by class basis as we want to apply it to any given resource. So now to demonstrate, I'll just give one example inside of employees, and you can apply it to other places if you want to. The main thing is that you understand the concept of how to create it. So I'm in the employees controller, and I'm going to go ahead and need to import that service. So inside of here, we'll say import logger service or my logger service. I think it's my logger service. There we go. And now that we've imported that, we can go right underneath the constructor here and say private read only logger. Let's set this equal to a new my logger service. Now inside of here, we're in the employees controller, and I want to pass in a context. And so this is going to be the employees controller dot name. So we're passing in the name of the controller. Now we have a context that will be logged with those log messages, so we know where whatever happened, happened. So let's go down to this find all method that we have under our get route, and let's log something. So now that we have this, let's say this dot logger. log. And now we can pass in any message we want to here. It's ready to go ahead and record. And one other thing that I want to do is actually get the IP address of whoever makes this request. And we can do that as well with another decorator from Nest.js. We'll need to bring that into our function also. So up here after our query, I'll press Alt-Z, so it'll probably wrap down. Let's also bring in IP with a capital I, lowercase p. So now we have the IP decorator back in this get route for find all. And let's start before the query because it can't be optional. We can't have something that's required after an optional param. So we need to put the IP first. It's going to be required. So here we have IP and we call it. Now we'll say IP is going to be a string. So now we have the IP address as well, and I'd like to record that. So let's first put in a message here that is a template literal request for all employees. And now after this, I'll put in a /t for a tab again, because I want to keep my file tab delimited. Again, this is a roll your own. Use something like Winston or something else. You probably wouldn't have to do that. Now I can pass in that IP value. So the last value should be the IP address. And so we're logging that, and it should go into our text file. And that's important if we're having any problem with any specific user requesting from a specific IP address. We're going to be able to record that now as well. Now, what about logging errors? Well, before we do that, we want to create our exception filter that's going to grab all the errors that happen everywhere so we can get an accurate record of everything that's going on in our application. Let's go back to the docs. We're back in the Nest.js docs, and we're looking at exception filters now. And this is under the overview with exception filters. Now, as it says here, you may want full control over the exceptions layer. Well, we definitely want some control. They give us several code snippets here. Here is a common filter that you could just copy this code from, http-exception.filter.ts, and create that file. And you could use that. We're going to do something a little bit different, but I took some code from here. So you want to be able to know what this is doing, understand how this is working. You can see it's getting these different values. CTX stands for context, by the way. Here's a response. Here's a request. Notice they're bringing in request and response from Express, which is under the hood. And then we're getting the status as well. It gets a little more complicated if the type of exception is not just an HTTP exception, but possibly any type of exception. And they've got a code example for that as well, where we're looking at all exceptions. And that's more or less what I want to create here. So I'm scrolling down. I know it's going to be down here soon. And they're showing how to apply some of that. Catch everything. So this is similar, but a little different. Notice the catch here does not have that HTTP passed in at all now. It's empty, and this is going to catch everything, and they're calling this class all exceptions filter. Now, I know if you just copy this code, it's going to have an issue or two, but what you need to look out for, what you will identify as the problem, is this exception. Before you can do anything like get the status of the exception that we saw in that previous code example and they use here too, you need to make sure exception is an instance of HTTP exception, and then it will have get status available. If not, they're going ahead and providing something else here, the internal server error, which would be a number, I believe, like 500 you would typically see with that. Now the response body is created after that, and they're sending a response. I'm going to show you my code. They give you most all of the code here. My code just pulls it together. We're back in VS Code, and we want to create our new file at the same level as our main TS file here inside of the source directory. So let's create a new file, and we'll call this all-exceptions.filter.ts, just like they did in the docs. Now, we've got a few things to import here at the top, so let's go ahead and start with that. We will import catch, and that comes from Nest.js common. Now, we need several other things besides just catch. We also need comma, then arguments host, HTTP status, and HTTP exception. Okay, I'm going to press Alt-Z so that wraps down to the next line. Now we know we're finished with that line. Let's go ahead and import the base exception filter because we're going to extend that. Now we also need to import request and response. That's going to come from Express, as we noted in that previous example as well. Once we've got those, we need to import our logger service too, because we want to write to our logs. So we're going to import my logger service. There it is. And after we have that, let's go ahead and import the Prisma client validation error. Now Prisma has several different errors. I'm just going to show you an example of this one. I'll show you where to find the others as well. Okay, I need a response type. So I'm just going to put this in here from my previous code. I can quickly go over it. I've just got my response object type, has a status code that's a number, timestamp that's a string, a path that's a string, and a response that can be a string or object. Now what this is formatting essentially the model or the way we want to handle our errors. And so this gives us control over our application, and we'll always be receiving errors with this information filled out. So it gives us a little bit more control than just a random error that we might have otherwise. Okay, let's scroll for some room. We need to start off with the catch decorator that we imported. So we'll call that. Then we want to export class all exceptions filter. And this is going to extend, so extends the base exception filter. Once we've done that, we need private read only, and let's bring in our logger. And we've done this before. We'll set it equal to a new mylogger service. We need to pass in now the all exceptions filter, and then of course get the name. So that gives it the context, which we did earlier for our logger too. Now we can start our catch, which will have an exception that is unknown. And of course, you can look in the docs to confirm this. And then we have host, and this is going to be the arguments host. So yes, I got that right out of the docs. So now let's bring in some values similar to what we saw in the example in the docs as well. Now if I save, we might get a better format. Nope, I need to do that. So I'm going to tab that over. There we go. So what we've got here is the context, once again, response and request. Those are the examples we saw in the docs. Now here's my initial response object, and I'm setting up the timestamp right away to an ISO string. I'm also setting this status code to 200 unless we run into an error or something else where we're going to overwrite that status code. And then, of course, we're going to have the response as well. So now in the interest of saving a little bit of time, I'm going to paste in the if and then else if statement, and we'll look at what it does. And I need Control V. There we go. I'll also need to format this. I think I turned off my format on save. So I'll just tab this over. Looks right now. So what I'm doing, and this is to help TypeScript help me as well, because the exception isn't always the same type, so it doesn't always have the same methods. So we need to check to see if the exception is an instance of the HTTP exception. Then we can use the getStatus and getResponse methods to set the status code for our response object as well as the response. But for example, if it's the Prisma client validation error, well then we want a 422 response, and I want to get that message, and it's a message that's broken into several lines. I'm actually using replace all here to replace the line breaks, so we get all of that in one line, and it will write neatly to our logs as well as send the proper status code. And I do just want to take a second to acknowledge that I put 200 here as the default. We're already in the all exceptions filter. Maybe I should go ahead and make that a 500 because we know we shouldn't be here without an exception. That is the catch-all internal server error that you would expect a status code for. That could be our default right here that we're getting from the HTTP status.internal server error as well. And our default response of internal server error. Okay, do I have an extra curly brace? I'm wondering. Nope, that is our catch right there, and that's green. So let me tab all of this in to get it on the right level. And now that looks correct to my eyes. After that, we need to go ahead and send our response. So let's go ahead and type response that we defined above. And now on the next line, let's go ahead and say status. And here for status, we can just reference our object where we already set the values. So my response object dot status code, and that is what we want to send for the status. Then let's send a JSON object for the message, or JSON string, I should say. My response object is what we're going to pass inside and send all of those values. Now we haven't logged anything yet, but we did bring in the logger. So we'll say this dot logger. This is where we can call the error method. And now we can pass in the exception. And you know what? Since we already have that message, let me go ahead and look at that one more time here. Oh yeah, and the replace all on it. What we actually want to do is not just pass in the exception. We want to pass in the my response object dot response that's already formatted for however or whatever type of error we receive. So let's pass that in to fulfill that exception. Now this also needs a host passed in. If we look at what we've got here, so we've got message any stack or context string. No, so the host defined, let me take a look. Oh, and I know the error. This shouldn't be going to my logger here. This goes in the next line. So I was looking one ahead. What I do want to send is the context here. This is the allExceptions.filter.name one more time. Now on the very next line where I was looking one line off, that certainly happens to me as well as probably everyone else every now and then. I want to send in the exception and the host with the super. Now this of course is passing on what should be happening already because we extended the base exception filter. So now we just allow it to carry out what it would have been carrying out. And that completes our all exceptions filter. Now after that, we still need to pull it in and apply it to our application. So let's go to the main.ts file. At the top of our file, besides the Nest factory, we also need to bring in HTTP adapter host from the Nest.js core. And then we need to bring in our all exceptions filter. So here we'll import all exceptions filter. Now we're finished with the imports. We need to add two more lines to our application here. So I'm going to say const, and now we destructure the HTTP adapter. This is going to come from app.get, and now we pass in the HTTP adapter host. And now on the next line, I'm wondering what's wrong here. We have app.get, and we didn't set it equal. We need an equal sign there. I'm creating a typo or two. Long tutorial. Okay, after HTTP adapter, we need app.use global filters. And now inside of this use global filters, we'll create a new all exceptions filter, and we pass in the HTTP adapter that it expects to receive. That completes everything we need. Now we should have applied this all exceptions filter that will grab all of the errors. And of course, we need to go ahead and try it out and make sure we're logging the errors we expect to log. We'll go control backtick to open up the terminal, npm run start :dev, and we'll get this up and running. We'll make a couple of requests and see if we can create some errors. And it looks like we've got an error, which isn't surprising as many typos as I've been making. Let's see what's going on. Oh, we didn't connect to Neon properly. Let's go ahead and try to restart this one more time. That can happen every now and then too. Let's go ahead and npm run dev. Let's see if it starts up correctly now. And yes, everything is started and it looks good. Let's go to Thunder Client where we can make some requests, and let's just request all employees. I'll scroll this down. We'll bring this down a little bit. Let's make sure it works. And yes, we got all the employees, so that's good. Let's make several rapid requests now. So 2, 3, 4. Too many requests. And here is the form or the format that we wanted for our errors. So we can see status code 429. We have the timestamp we wanted. We can see the path that was requested and too many requests. So that worked as expected. Okay, now let's try this one more time, and I may have to wait depending on what we exceeded. Let's set our role. Let's set it equal to admin and see if we get a successful request. Yes, we have the admin employees, so that's good. Now, what if we set this to something like you just saw there, like pasta? Let's see what happens. That's not a role. Ah, now we got our 422 because that was a Prisma validation error. So you can see the path that was requested, and we have this long message. As a matter of fact, it breaks down to several lines, even though we made it return on one line because it's long. But when we get to the end of it, at least, Prisma gives us something that we can definitely understand. Invalid value for argument role, expected role. So pasta is not a valid value for that. So it says invalid right here at the beginning as well. But we can figure out what we want from those messages. So we've got the 422 that we expected as well. Everything worked well there as far as what we wanted in a response. Let's look at the file tree now and see if we have a logs directory. And we do, and we have a mylog file. Let's check this out. So we had a request for all employees. Now something came in undefined here, which I believe that's the context. We might want to see if we did something wrong there. But yes, the context with all exceptions filter is good here. So that's important. Let's go ahead and see if everything else came in as expected. Yep, the too many requests problem. That's fine. So everything's recording. We just have an undefined value here that should be the context for this request. We want to find out what's happening there. Also, I want to highlight this. If we pull up Control F, now we're searching for something. Let's backspace over this. Let's press the dot asterisk so we know we're using regex, and we can search for that backslash t. Lowercase t is what we actually want here. And there we go. So now you can see all of the tabs in this file. It's all tab delimited. It doesn't look like they're the same spaces, but they are. So this would import correctly into a spreadsheet or something if you were making a text log file. So that's what we wanted as well. Let's take a quick look at that employees controller just to see why we're not getting the context that we expect to get. So here is this.logger.log request for all employees. That looks fine. Let's come up to the top here. Private read-only logger, new mylogger service, and we're passing in the context here as well. This tells me I might have something wrong in the log method itself for mylogger. Let's go back and look at that. We're in the mylogger service now, and let's take a look at what we're passing in when we log something here. And I think I see my issue. I'm only passing in a message to the log, and it actually needs the context passed in as well. So let's go back to that employees controller now, and let's verify that. So when we scroll down here and find where we're logging, we're only passing in the message. Let's go ahead and pass in that context. So the context was employees controller.name. And now that should not be undefined in our log if we go ahead and have another issue. So let's do that. We've still got our server running. Go to our endpoints over here. Send another request for the role pasta. We send that in. It's unprocessable. That's fine. But we did make a request, right? No, this was the other issue. So what we want to do maybe is make a get all request. Or maybe it actually logged both. I think that's what's happening because it's logging when we're making the get all request route, but it's also catching the validation error. So let's see what we've got. And now if we come down here, that is exactly what's happening. So before we had undefined and all exceptions filter with the invalid, but here we now have the employees controller and the all exceptions filter. So we're getting the context of each. So I just missed passing in that context with the log statement inside of the employees controller. We're in the Prisma docs now. I promised I would talk about all of the different Prisma errors, and you see them here on the right under the error message reference. You could look for all of these inside of that if, else if statement and handle them accordingly to each error. So we talked about the validation error, but you could get other Prisma client errors as well, like possibly not connecting to the database, for example. Things like that that could be handled here also. And finally, I want to highlight one package we did not use because it's not built into Nest.js, but it is a commonly used package from a third party here called Nestjs-Prisma. And they just make the implementation when you're using Prisma fairly easy to do. And so they've added some extra nice things. We've got logging middleware and an exception filter here too, that you could also look at how to do these same things with. I just wanted to cover what was built into Nest.js. And with that, we have completed a full REST API in Nest.js. Now you should customize this, make it your own, especially when it comes to the data. I just gave examples, but this series should have been a good starting point for anyone getting started with Nest.js. Not beginners to programming, but again, beginners to working with the Nest.js framework that is built on top of Node.js and Express. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection. And a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you. And thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.